Hello, iGEM. Come, come, come. I hope not everyone is having lunch, because for the next talk, we're going to talk about vaccines. And maybe to put yourself in the shoes of our next speaker, I'd like you to imagine that you are a scientist working on vaccine development, and all of a sudden, the world stops due to a new virus that threatens the world. The borders close, and every hour matters. Now, what do? Do you drop all of your projects in order to save millions of lives? This is exactly the question that the next speaker had to ask himself. He's one of the scientists who led the development of the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID vaccine and became part of one of the greatest scientific collaborations in history. His scientific work in the Oxford lab turned into a project to globally distribute millions of vaccines worldwide. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome Adam Ritchie on this stage and tell you his story.
Hello, iGEMers. It's a real privilege for me to be able to come and speak to you today. I'm going to talk about a project I was very involved in, the delivery of billions of doses of a vaccine very quickly at a time that was a challenge for all of us, I'm sure. And what I'm really going to talk about is the things that allowed our team to do what we did. Things that over the last day or two I've experienced speaking to iGEM teams around and listening to their talk. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is quite iGEM-y things we did, perhaps just at a slightly bigger scale, under a little bit more pressure and under a slightly stronger sense of urgency. So if you're anything like me as a scientist, you like data and you like graphs, but this is my absolute favorite data graph of all time because of what it represents. This is the graph of the independent estimation of lives saved by the major vaccines in their first year of use during the pandemic. And to the far side, you see the two big ones, our one, Oxford AstraZeneca, and the Pfizer vaccine, around 6 million each, but then all the other ones as well, adding up to well over 10 million lives saved, almost 20 million lives saved. And that represents decades of development by people across the world, effort by me, my colleagues at Oxford, all our collaborators all over the world on our vaccine, everyone involved in all these other vaccines, but also the vaccines that didn't quite make it, that aren't on the list here. We all had to put in the effort, and some of us maybe got lucky, and some of us didn't, but we all put in the effort to try and make a difference when we were called to try and do so. What I really want to emphasize is a few things that allow you to make an impact at this sort of level. So you need the skill to do it, all right? And hopefully a lot of you are developing those skills through your education and programs like this. You need to put in the effort, right? What are you willing to sacrifice when the moment comes? What are you willing to give up for your project, your weekends, your free time, and how do you balance that against things like mental health and the rest of the balance of your life? There is then luck, much harder for you to control, but they do say you make your own luck, and I think there's an element of truth in that, but you don't have full control. You might work well, you might work hard, but it's part of science that sometimes the answer is no, and that happened for some of my colleagues working on other vaccines. The other two really big things that matter, and that I'd really like people to take away, is understanding what you're actually trying to do. What is your strategic goal? Not the goal that looks a bit similar, sounds a bit similar, or a step goal on the way that you can get caught up on. What's the real thing you're trying to achieve? Because that should then dictate your decisions and what you and your team do. And finally, recognizing in yourself what you're good at, what you're not so good at, and seeing that in your colleagues to build a truly collaborative team. And if there's one element of my experience with this program that I see at iGEM, it's that. Teams coming together everyone talking the language of science and synthetic biology, but some may be a bit more focused on the marketing, some are doing the work in the lab more, some are doing computing. All those things need to come together, and you've got to work out who in your team's going to do what. So in May 2020, this was published by Boston Consulting Group, and in that first year of the pandemic, I think this was about the best external estimate of what was happening. In the top part, you see the classic program to develop a vaccine, 10 years or more, stepwise. We do some development in the lab, we apply for money, we then manufacture, we apply for more money for the phase 1 trial, and there's year gaps between some of those steps, right? And we only think about manufacturing at the end, and manufacturing and how we did that early is really what I'm going to focus on today. In the bottom 2/3 of the graph, you see Boston Consulting thinking about what a compressed program looks like, and it's a bit like that. They did a pretty good job here. Things are overlapping instead of being sequential like they normally are, and we took a lot of risk. Now, in the public, that was sometimes worried about as some sort of safety risk. That wasn't what was happening. It was financial risk, and people bought into what we were trying to do. So to take one example, if I want to start a phase 1 trial for a vaccine in the UK, I make a submission to the regulator, and they take 2 months to get back to me. I respond to that. They take another 2 months to get back to me, and then maybe I can start my trial. In the case of our COVID phase 1 trial, the regulator was sitting there, all the senior people in a room, waiting at 2 p.m. in August on the day we told them we'd get the package to them, and they then reviewed it like they normally would. But we just didn't have to wait, and that's one of the ways you accelerate things. But the big financial risk that even Boston Consulting Group didn't quite get right was that top grey part, commercial scale manufacturing. That started the same day we started the phase 1 trial manufacturing batch, the grey section below. Because we had that strategic meeting, we had that strategic decision, we got together in a room, 6 of us, decided to do this program as quickly as we could, but we asked ourselves a question, what's the goal? And normally in our research, the goal is simple. A safe, effective vaccine that then goes to a company or gets spun out of the university, and that's where it goes, and that's where our real interest in it ends. But we knew this time that if our clinical trial said the vaccine worked, there was going to be a clamour for doses the next day. So you had to start making it immediately. That's what we decided to do. So who's we? So a couple of pictures here. On your left is a picture from the lab in 2018. A group of us were working to try and develop a better manufacturing process using the vaccine platform, but for rabies. Rabies is my big interest, not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about COVID. But we spent a few years trying to work out how to make rabies vaccines cheaper. And to do that, we thought what you need is a manufacturing process that scales up, so each dose becomes cheaper. At scale, things become cheaper, right? Step 1. But also a process we could transfer to manufacturers in low or middle income countries. And that was our big focus at that time. Pandemic comes along and we immediately pivot all that work over to COVID. Quite easy for us to do, although a lot of work. And on the other side, you see a picture of 3 of us in the lab. So obviously myself, my colleague Sandy Douglas, who's a clinician, and then Karina Joe, who's the real whiz in the lab. Karina actually left science before she did her PhD for a couple of years, because she had one other passion, which was experimental cooking for fine dining. She actually worked as a chef at high-end restaurants doing experimental cooking. And you could see how her mind worked in the lab. You could see, and make no mistake, when she worked with us, I'd have dinner parties all the time to get her to cook stuff for us. But she would pull apart, whether it was a recipe, whether it was a manufacturing process, she'd pull it apart and see ways to improve it. And I talked about luck, and Karina is the story of luck in this. We created the luck by hiring someone so good and working with her, but there was a timing thing that really mattered. In the second half of 2019, she pulled apart the process we'd been working on for rabies and found a way to increase yields 30-fold. Okay? We ended up making 3 billion doses of the vaccine. Take that discovery away, make it happen in 2023, and we make 100 million doses instead. What does that do to the graph? The thing that really matters, the impact, the lives saved. 5.5 to 6 million people die. Right? That is luck in science. That's what it looks like. So the 3 of us ran this program from Oxford. But we put out a cry for help in February through the Bioindustry Association. Said, hey, we have a vaccine, no idea if it'll work, but we'd really love you to come along and help us make it. And companies from the UK, from Europe, from China, from India, all signed up to get involved, and we developed the process from the lab scale we had to a huge scale with all of them. There are also suppliers getting involved, companies that make the consumables, the buffers, the bioreactors, the filters, all of them getting involved to ensure we had the materials we needed for the program. And when the lockdowns ended and we were able to get together, we were fortunate enough to come together for a dinner in Oxford. Now, the other thing I'd like to really say is, if I can contribute to something like this, everyone here can contribute to something like this. Okay, I was just in the right place at the right time. There was nothing special about me growing up. I was born in Australia to a very poor, uneducated family. Neither of my parents got close to finishing high school. University was a foreign language, no idea what it was. I got into science in high school. My mother was excited that one of her sons might go to university. My dad was a bit indifferent. But he took me to the open day when I was 16. I said, Dad, I want to go to UNSW and find out what it's all about. And I remember it so strongly. He got a newspaper on the way, parked next to the university, and said to me, Adam, off you go, be back in 2 hours. And I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I wandered around and saw other kids with parents or in school groups, and that was the first time I really started to feel maybe this wasn't for me, right? Maybe this wasn't my space. And I did go to university and made a lot of friends, and here are some of my peers I did my PhD with. All 5 of us are still scientists. We work across 3 different continents on all sorts of different things, catch up every once in a while, and I hope you all do that with your iGEM friends in 25 years from now. But a lot of them had parents who were academics, engineers, or medics, scientists, and it felt to me they'd been having conversations I just didn't have. Like, there are scholarships or internships, all these things just meant absolutely nothing to me at the time. And so I thought I'd missed out on something, but I took the wrong lesson away. And it was only when I started working as a postdoc in Oxford that I realised I'd acquired something else. Because my parents, although I was born into a poor family, by the time I went to university, they were no longer poor. Because what they had done is they started a couple of small businesses and took risk. They had very little, but they gambled on themselves. And while I didn't get to talk about what's a new scientist at dinner time, I got to hear about how the buck stops with you. You're in charge. When something goes wrong, it doesn't matter if it's unfair, it doesn't matter who caused it, you've got to fix it, because if you don't, it's your business that fails. And that is an attitude I was lucky enough to take into all the work I've done ever since. And so my strength, my skill, is I marry the scientific with the translational and the delivery, and we've got to do this no matter what. Other people bring other things, and recognizing what you're good at and what they're good at is a big part of being successful. What was the big thing we really did, our team really did? So yes, we needed to scale up our process, but the most important thing I will ever do in my life is we push for distributed manufacturing. What does that mean? Well, we took that scaled up process, working with these companies in India and China and everywhere else, and we got it made in as many places as we could. And there was one reason for that: strategic goal. What's the goal? As many doses to as many people in as many places as possible. So we sat down in February and said, what's going to stop us meeting that goal? Very predictable vaccine nationalism, top of the list. I'm not in control of governments. I can't stop the UK or the US from putting export controls in place. They don't listen to me. Right? But what I can do is I can mitigate the risk by getting it out to as many places as possible. And I'm an academic, I don't work in industry. When AstraZeneca joined us in May 2020, I was initially a little bit skeptical and worried they would stop this process and take it in-house, much like other programs were doing. But I'm delighted to say they were a wonderful partner and in fact expanded the distributed manufacturing. And you see what that means here. On the right-hand side, we have bars representing millions of doses made of the different vaccines, with the colours telling you where they were made. And one of those bars is not like the other. And it's the second one down, our one. Yes, there's a big orange chunk in the middle. The Serum Institute of India made about 1.5 billion doses, but look at all the other colours. Argentina, Russia, China, lots of places making our vaccine, so that when one country put export controls in place, other countries could step in and keep doses going to COVAX, to go to Africa and other places where they weren't manufacturing the vaccine directly. And you can see in the world map, those red countries are the countries where we made our vaccine in that first year. But what are the lessons we learn? Well, this is about manufacturing now. We've learned that our old paradigm, which we still live with for most programs, is something we can change and need to change to respond to emergencies like this. So once upon a time, that slow process from lab design to a phase 1 trial says at least a year. A year's optimistic. I've never done that in a year under normal circumstances. Takes a couple of years normally, many years to get to million dose scale, and then who knows if you'll ever get to a bigger scale than that. Phase 1 batch in the pandemic, less than 100 days. Pretty quick. And even though Tony Fauci and others had said it would be at least a year and a half, we got to the million dose scale in less than a year from the start of the pandemic. And 1 billion doses just over 200 days after that, so scaling up very fast. We continue working on our platform. People are working on mRNA and other platforms looking to address next time. Hopefully it never happens, but if it does, we need to be ready. And we can now, through technical improvements, get that phase 1 batch done in about 60 days. And then the million and billion dose scale, that's much more about manufacturing and logistics. Because we've done it before, because we've tested it in the real world, the material is there, the massive bioreactors are there ready to go, so we could pivot much more quickly and scale up. The challenge to that is going to be the decision to do it, primarily by governments. Are they going to fund it at the right time, or are they going to wait 6 months and then start the clock ticking? So we will end where we began, with what really matters, which is the impact of our work. At least that's what I feel. Impact is what matters. And the millions of lives saved. And a little reminder of what I think matters, and if you have a lesson to take away from my experience, remember skills, effort, and luck. You need all three to have a big impact. You can make some of your own luck, but sometimes you will be unlucky. Understanding your strategic goals. Don't try and hit the goal adjacent to your goal. The reason we were the academic-led program that made a difference is because we understood that quicker than others, that we needed to get manufacturing front and center. And recognize the diversity of your own skills, your teammates, your colleagues, and collaborators, because that's what will allow you to do something bigger than the sum of your individual parts. And I see you all doing this at iGEM. It's a great little smaller scale run of what we did. Take the lessons from what you're doing here. And I hope one day, I hope it's not under an emergency like we had to do, because we had to pay a high price mentally and other ways for it. But I hope someday, 10, 20 years from now, I'll be sitting in that audience listening to one of you tell us about the impact your work has had. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam, for that wonderful story. Now, I'd like to take a bit of time to go a little deeper on some of what you just told us, because it's quite an impressive journey, right? You have probably worked, I don't know for how long, on the vaccine against rabies.
Yeah, about 8 years now.
8 years, yeah. When COVID hit, that was...
So it would have been about 3 years for me
3 years,
on the rabies vaccine. Yeah, got a bit distracted. Rabies got put to the side for a while, but it's now back for me.
And you got that insight that you may have something that can save the world, so to speak.
Maybe.
But you probably took quite a bit of risk, right? You dropped everything. There was no clarity on government funding at that time.
Yeah, you know, there was a risk, but the risk, you may be faced with similar questions one day. Again, that experience of my parents, seeing them decide to take risk, and that changed my family's life. And the lessons I took from that made it easy for me to push for risk-taking. We did one or two things that were career risky. So there were things I did where if it had not panned out and the pandemic had just stopped or our vaccine had collapsed very early, I would have had serious questions to answer about using funding for other disease programs to kick off the program on the COVID vaccine. We kicked another vaccine out of the manufacturing facility halfway through being made. The owner of that vaccine was not very happy with us. But our judgment, and it was really a moral one, was this was a decision to be made. I can live with being fired. What I couldn't live with was the idea that I was too much of a coward to make a decision to take a risk when it was needed.
And all three of you were right initially?
Yeah, absolutely. All three of us.
All three of you had the same mindset?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah? I mean, especially Sandy and I. Karina is very strong technically, but also is now doing a lot of spin-outs and sort of biotech in Asia, sort of thing is quite prominent there. But yeah, we were all very driven to get the job done. It was hard at times, but the drive was there.
And how did you convince the first partners to get involved?
Yeah, so, when you work in the field, you sort of notice something like a pandemic coming before it arrives. We knew it was happening. Obviously, people working in those companies had a similar sense to what we had. So we thought lockdown was probably coming. Things had started in Italy, so people were aware of it, and so people were receptive to my message. I mean, I'm fairly convincing when I'm trying to tell someone to help us out, but it helps if there's a pandemic coming and they're worried their family's going to die. So people were willing to drop things, join up to our program. The thing that really impressed me was the manufacturing organisations are nominally competitors with each other, but we would just sit on calls with 100 people talking through technical details of upstream, downstream, how we're going to set the parameters, quality control, quality assurance, and everyone's just revealing their secrets, the secret sauce, which bioreactors we think work better or don't, why, and it was a little bit like the Colonel's 11 herbs and spices, right? Everyone was just giving them away, and that isn't what I'd expected. I'd been pretty skeptical about industry, I'm ashamed to say, but that taught me actually we were all pulling in the same direction.
So there you are. You have your fantastic group of experts working really hard. At the same time, I can imagine that there is so much pressure in this race against time, where kind of, I don't know, you probably feel that every day lost is X number of lives.
Yeah, absolutely. We had that as a mantra.
Yeah.
A day is 100,000 deaths. And it was difficult for everyone. Karina found it challenging at times because she'd come to the UK fairly recently. So, I had my family at home, which she didn't have. And sometimes we had conversations after we had worked for 60 days, literally 16 hours every day. That takes a toll.
How do you mentally digest that? How do you deal with it?
You don't. You fail. You deal with it as best you can. I've always been a big guy, you might have noticed, but I'm a bigger guy now than I was. I put on 30 kilos in 4 months. So I ate it. I ate my anxiety. Some of us cried our anxiety. Some of us fought with our partners and got divorced. There were prices paid by people who did this program that last today. 2 years afterwards, some of us got drawn into a response to an Ebola outbreak in Uganda. 2 of us had mental breakdowns at the start of that. PTSD very much. But if you ask me, would I do it again, I would. And that's the decision we made with Ebola, is that we would go again, even though we knew it would be hard, because of the slide, because of the 6 million people. And we thought Ebola's probably not going to get out of control. It's unlikely we'd have anything like this impact. It's probably not even needed. And sure enough, they got it under control with breaking the infection cycle. But if that had gotten out of control and we hadn't done something, I wouldn't have been able to live with myself.
The final outcome is, of course, very successful.
Sure.
I guess if the outcome would have been less successful, perhaps
Maybe, it's hard.
Would you still feel the same?
I'm aggressively rational in these things, almost heartless about it. I like to think I'd say yes, but of course I wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. It'd be someone else. And in fact, it was a conversation Karina and I had often, which was, after all these days, all these hours, we are going to do the best work we can. We are going to work as hard as we can, because we might be holding the secret. And we're going to trust the people at Pfizer and at all these other universities to do the same thing, to do high quality work and work hard. We don't know if we'll win, we don't know if they'll win, we don't know if there'll be lots of winners. There were lots of winners, right? But you can't not put in the effort when it's needed.
Yeah. Going to another topic, because what really impressed me about this story is how you managed to distribute the production at such a global scale over so many different countries, so many different factories. Having worked a little bit in quality assurance and quality control, I wonder what's your secret sauce to make sure that all these factories aligned on the same standards, especially on such a short time frame?
Yeah, so that's a big part of the sort of management of a large program. No one can do everything. So what I was running at one point was daily meetings of the big team and then subgroup meetings. And so one of our subgroups was quality, right? And so we had quality assurance and quality control people from the manufacturing organisations all together, and something that's quite UK specific, something called a qualified person. They have an important regulatory role in the UK. And we got together as a group, gave lead responsibility to a couple of those people, and we all worked together, and we'd meet every second day, right? Defining the parameters, meeting with the regulators to talk through new ways of doing the quality control and release testing for a vaccine, moving away from some of the long-winded animal testing to next-gen sequencing for agents that might get into the vaccine and you want to be sure aren't there. So it really was about defining a process, working with the manufacturers, not just of the vaccine, but the manufacturers of the components that go into it, to ensure the same process and the same materials were going to every factory, and that the same quality control processes were in place, so that the thing that came out at the end was the same every time. Yeah, but it was, a sentence I've used about 6 times since we sat down. It was challenging.
Yeah. And so that seemed to have worked pretty well. You were the first vaccine to be on the market.
Very close after Pfizer, I think.
Okay.
So Pfizer and Astra Oxford have lived a double life together, sort of thing, quite a lot.
How do you compare the distribution of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine versus the mRNA vaccines? What are some of the advantages probably that the AstraZeneca?
Yeah, so I think the core one is that distributed manufacturing. I think if other companies, and I get why they didn't, like quality is harder under distributed manufacturing than just in-house manufacturing, right? You have less control. And if you're a pharmaceutical company, you might be very concerned about the reputational damage of something going wrong. And things did go wrong, but often not with our vaccine. There was a very bad incident in the US where there was a contamination of one vaccine with another vaccine at a factory trying to make 2 at once. So, I get the reasons for it, but I really think distributed manufacturing wasn't inherent to what we were doing. Other companies could have done that, other people could have done it, but they chose not to. And I think if they had, it wouldn't have fully solved inequality of access to vaccines, but it would have made the situation better. I think we made a major contribution to that. As you saw on the graph, the bulk of our production was in India, about 50% of our production. And you may or may not remember, India had a very, very bad wave in 2021, which meant they put in export controls. So suddenly there was no vaccine coming out of India to feed the rest of the world. They desperately needed it. But the South Korean manufacturer was able to scale up quickly, increase their outputs, and supply into what was called COVAX, the program for distributing to other countries. So I think that was the big one. Compared to mRNA, we had some advantages in thermostability, which made distribution in warm environments a bit better, less reliance on cold chain. Our platform is still much more reliant on cold chain than I would like. It's one of my other research areas, is how to improve that for future and for my rabies program. So I think they're the big ones. It was really the decision to do the distributed manufacturing that made the biggest difference, but then some things around, the ability to use it, longer shelf life at cold instead of freezing temperatures.
So, I mean, the vaccine was given to so many people. Then it's also expected that in a very small fraction of the patients, some unexpected side effects appear. This is not rare to this specific vaccine. It happens in all the vaccines. At the same time, I can imagine then that once the public started to notice these and talk about it in the media, the acceptance of the vaccine was impacted by that. Can you share a bit of
absolutely. And I think the first thing to say is there is a side effect, a blood clot related side effect with the adenovirus vectored vaccines. That's our one and the one that came from Johnson & Johnson and one or two other places. Much like there's a myocarditis side effect with the mRNA vaccines. And so it did affect acceptance, and it was very much, if you think about it, the sort of messaging those who were against the vaccines to start with were waiting for, because the anti-vaxxers got to go see, I told you it was all done too fast and it wasn't safe and this is what happens. But you know, I consider myself fortunate. The way I see the world is about risk. Everything is a risk. Coming to Paris was a risk. Walking up onto the stage is a risk. You might trip over and fall, right? All these things exist. There are no guarantees with anything. The difference between vaccines and most other medicines is, of course, we give vaccines to massive numbers of healthy people. So the tolerance of side effects is much lower than, say, in oncology. You know, if someone has cancer and they're very ill, you know, common side effects are quite acceptable. Now, there is an element of time that, you know, social media and the amount of attention paid to things means there's a lot of noise around everything. In reality, the side effects, and they are dangerous, but they're very rare. It's safer than, say, the yellow fever vaccines that are used and several other vaccines that are used, but because it's new, modern technology, it got particular traction. And that is a challenge going forward. And, you know, I am delighted to have helped save 6 million lives, but the reality is there are a few people out there who did die after taking our vaccine because of the side effects. It did happen. And that's very unfortunate. I want to save them as well. And so colleagues in Germany, at Oxford, and lots of places are trying to understand the mechanism of what happened. Really unfortunate was what happened was very clinically misunderstood in the early months. And so the treatment was the wrong treatment, and that contributed to the problems. But we now understand that part better, so clinical care is better when it happens, but we want to engineer the platform to get rid of the problem. That's the goal.
So you seem very open about discussing the risks publicly. How did people respond to that? Were they receptive to this kind of balanced, honest story?
So I think it's important in communication. And thinking about, again, what your goal is if you're talking to a public audience. This is quite a different audience, obviously, very technical. I'm going to assume you're broadly on my side. I'm not talking to a room of anti-vaxxers or anything like that, or anti-synth bio people. But they do exist out there, and you've got to think about who you talk to. And I'm actually, as much as I enjoy talking to this audience, one of the things that I think is really can't be emphasized enough is the importance of communicating across the silos, talking to the other side. And I accept that an anti-vaxxer is not going to come and hold hands with me, right? That's not really what I'm talking about. But in a pandemic, or even just normally, you know, there are people who are nervous about things. You know, the vaccines were developed much more quickly than normal, right? That was a great scientific and management success. But if you're a member of the public, it just looks like it was done fast. It's normal to be worried about that. I accept that. And so I took the opportunity when it came up, which some people didn't really want to do, which was to talk to, let's say, some news outlets who are on the other side of things, because I knew listening to those conversations were people who were doubtful, people who were unsure. And I can talk to, let's just say The Guardian or somewhere like that, somewhere very on my side of things. And I can talk to an audience, and I'm not really going to convince anyone to get vaccinated, because they're going to go and get vaccinated anyway. What am I going to tell them? They're going to tell me how awesome I am, and everyone likes that. That feels good, but it doesn't do anything. But if you talk to the Fox Newses of the world, other organizations, sure, a lot of people just go, shut up, don't care. But there are people listening who will come with you, and they will move to your side, and they will think about it more. And it's so important, because even if just 5% of the audience you're speaking to moves a little in your direction, that's a much bigger impact than people who already agree with you coming with you. But the important thing is don't lie. Don't lie. Don't make predictions that can prove to be wrong. It's one of the biggest errors I've seen in the climate change space, is I've seen people make predictions, and I get why. There's a catastrophe coming. But when that prediction doesn't come true, the other side points and goes, see, they're lying. You can't trust them. And avoiding that should override everything else, in my view.
Yeah, that's a nice takeaway. Okay, so where are you now, actually, after all of this? What happened to your career after this experience?
So it's very much the same as it was. I probably am about the worst person for young people to ask career advice to, because I never have had a plan. I have a simple rule, is I want to feel like my work matters, and I want to be happy today and tomorrow. And whenever that becomes untrue, I just wander off and get a different job. So, I've never been fired. That's a nice thing to say. I've always just got bored of what I was doing and gone somewhere else. But, so I never had a plan. I never went, I've got to be a professor by 40, or I've got to do this. And there's maybe that comes from my background a little bit. Like, I never thought it mattered. And I don't really care. Like, if someone calls me a professor or doesn't call me, it saves millions of lives. Who gives a... I won't swear, I almost did. Who cares about what they call you, right? I know what I did. That's what I'll remember when I die. My family, the impact of my work. I'm not going to remember what people called me. And so my work's not really changed. I care about rabies because the access to rabies vaccine is an issue of inequality. There are great vaccines out there, they work. If you're a Westerner traveling to an area that's got rabies, you go, you pay a couple of $100, you get vaccinated, great. The kids in the area you go to don't get vaccinated because no one's going to pay $80 to vaccinate a kid in India, right? So that annoys me. So that's what I care about, and that's what I really want to achieve. And I guess sometimes annoyance is where your passion might come from. It does for me at times. So I look into the world, I see the thing that annoys me, and that's where I throw my effort.
So how far is this rabies vaccine? Can we expect that for the next years?
Yeah, possibly, because it's a big, for us on the, so we're about to publish our phase 2 clinical trial. I was dealing with the comments from reviewers before I came here, and I've left it with a colleague to try and clean up the last few, and I hope to have it out possibly by the end of this year, actually. And it's a bit of a spoiler, but the results are ridiculously good for the vaccine. It performs well beyond our dreams. We really went into it just with a goal of addressing the money issue and the distribution issue, but actually it might even be better than existing vaccines. So I hope that takes a lot of my focus over the next few years, scaling up that work, working with the African mRNA Vaccine Hub to develop an mRNA rabies vaccine that's manufactured, designed, and developed in Africa. It's another thing I'm working on. It's about finding the stuff that annoys you and thinking about how do we address it. Manufacturing in Africa is like just an absolute has to happen thing. It was, I didn't emphasize it, but when you look at that map of where our vaccine was made, even with all the effort we put in, Africa has no red on it. Right? There hasn't been much manufacturing there. It is massively improving, and lots of organisations like the World Health Organization with the tech transfer hubs and others are really starting to make a difference there for scale, and that's one of the things I'd like to see really improve.
This makes me think that probably the distributed manufacturing of the vaccine also had a huge impact on technological advancement in many countries. Is that right? Or
I don't know. You'd have to.
I don't know. I'm just thinking about it.
You'd have to ask them. I mean, we transferred it to places which were already set up as manufacturing companies, right? So Serum Institute of India. There's stories that disappear, right? And so I'm going to tell you one of the stories of two people, which just disappears in the noise of the pandemic. But Serum Institute of India did a bunch of work to scale up the program, scale up their facilities. And unfortunately, two of the workers doing that work died during the process in an accident. And they're just two people who disappear in the story, but, they gave their lives, literally gave their lives to make sure vaccine became available for their people and for the rest of the world. So I don't know how much tech advancement, what we did it wasn't something we were thinking about at the time. We really were transferring into places that had some capacity. I did spend, before I joined the rabies vaccine program, I spent 5 or 6 years working in policy instead. And one of the things that bugged me there was the unevenness of the global north, global south relationship, something I'm very conscious of in our research. And something I'd like to see improved, but to really get massive improvement, you need a big bottom of the pyramid, so educational improvement, so you have local people coming through, who develop the technical skills and can become the scientists of the future to drive their own programs. It's great me coming in and going, hey, rabies is a problem, let's work on rabies. I'd much rather someone come to me. Like I really look for, before I retire, I really would like someone to come to me from an area where there's a disease and convince me to help them on that, rather than it being the other way around.
Okay. So looking back, what do you think is the great lesson about collaboration that the world should not forget now moving out of this pandemic? Because things seem to have been quite different also in what you just told us about the way that different companies came together and kind of put aside the practices that they normally have. Yeah. Can we continue some of what you've seen?
I hope so. I think the EU and Germany are doing an excellent job of staying engaged with the companies that they would need if something was to happen. So, they've set up programs to do test runs every year or two. 1 year will be an mRNA vaccine. And basically what happens is they have companies lined up, they buy space, and they go, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to tell you a disease, we're going to give you a vaccine, and we want you to make it as if it was a pandemic. Right? And they test the capacity, they learn lessons over and over again. There are other countries that are not doing that, and the UK is one of them, who has gone badly backwards in my view. We've engaged with the government on that, but that's a lesson that's really not being learnt. For the younger audience and the team members and the iGEMers, I think the first lesson is your passion. Some of the strategic goal things, I think they're super important, but it's hard to get a full grip on very early in your career. I think a bit of experience helps you understand that. So when I was a PhD student, one of the best things I did was I wrote my first paper 18 months into my PhD. And that was a good experience, but what it really told me was I had failed to address some of the things I needed to do experimentally to make my story work. I had done experiments to get data, not fully understanding what the story was I needed to tell. And publishing that first paper basically made me write a section on the limitations of my work are A, B, C, D, E, and I need to go and address all of those, right? So that sort of learning experience you can have along the way, and that's what leads to, when you're sort of my age, my position, the ability to sort of identify things on what was a global scale.
What advice do you have for some of the iGEMers in the room who have projects with potential positive impact globally or locally? Yeah. How can they be more strategic, you think?
Yeah, so, it's tricky early on, like I say, but I think about, and I've asked a few, the why question, so sometimes the technical details there, but what's the next step isn't always there. I've seen some where they really are thinking about how it gets to the community or to those in need, sort of thing, and I think that's a real strength, trying to develop that thinking. Just practice it, think about it. You can think about it with all sorts of things. It doesn't even have to be about science. You can think about, I'm moving somewhere, I need to rent an apartment. Actually, what are my goals within an apartment rather than just grabbing the first thing I see? Last week I sat down with my team of young scientists and had the very exciting lunchtime conversation about how do their pensions work, sort of thing. What's your goal when you're 65, but you're 25 and looking forward? You can think about all these things the same way. And it's just good to get into the practice of going, what's your goal? What's going to help you get there? And understanding why you've set that as your goal.
Thank you so much, and I wish you all the best with your follow-up projects. We unfortunately don't have time for a Q&A session in the setup, but Adam told me that he's very pleased to meet you a little outside of the stage if you have any questions for him. So thank you very much for attending this session, and I wish you a very nice day.
Thanks, Nadine.